The morning was cold and still, the kind of stillness that comes before color returns to the world. In the village of Larkfield, the sun had barely cleared the stone wall at the far edge of the churchyard when the first word went out. Mrs. Paul's door stood open, and the physician's horse was already at the gate. By the time the market stalls were uncovered and the baker's boy had made his second round, the word had reached the apothecary, and from the apothecary it had spread to the inn, and from the inn to the milliner's, and by 10 o'clock in the morning it had settled over the whole of Larkfield like weather. The young woman in Mrs. Pole's cottage, the one who had arrived the previous March with a single trunk and a quiet manner and no maid and no explanation that anyone could entirely credit, had delivered not one child but two. A boy and a girl, both alive. Both well inside the cottage, Cecily lay against the pillow with her eyes half closed, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has accomplished something her body did not know it could manage. She was 24 years old. Her dark hair was damp at the temples, and her brown eyes, when they opened, were calmer than anyone entering that room might have expected. Agnes Pole sat in the chair beside the bed with her stout hands folded in her lap, and she was not calm at all. Her face was red with the effort of having kept her composure through the night, and she had not fully succeeded because her eyes were still bright with the tears she had refused to shed in front of the doctor. Mr. Gree. Silas Fenwick stood at the foot of the bed with his bag in his hand and wrote in his ledger with a steadiness that did not quite conceal that he too had passed a night he would not soon forget. He was a careful man, and Larkfield was a small place, and he understood the weight of what he was writing down. 2 children. Born in the 5th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1815. Mother in satisfactory health. Father Edward Deverall, Earl of Ashmore. He did not look up when he wrote that last name. Cecily's right hand lay on the coverlet, and at her wrist, still knotted there from the night before, was a short length of blue ribbon. Agnes had offered to remove it when the labor began, and Cecily had said no. It had stayed. The children were asleep in the cradle that Agnes had borrowed from the rector's wife 3 weeks before, wrapped together. Their faces turned toward each other as though they had already decided on an alliance against whatever waited outside that room. Cecily looked at them for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes, and the stillness of the cottage held. She had not expected to feel this. She had thought, during the longest hours of the night, that she would feel the particular bitterness of a woman whose vindication has arrived too late to matter. She had been wrong. What she felt was simpler and stranger, and did not have a name she could easily reach for. She had kept faith with something, and it had kept faith with her, and that was enough for this morning. What came next could wait until she had slept. Outside in the lane, the village of Larkfield went on making up its mind about what this meant. None of them yet knew what it would cost before it was finished. It had begun in the spring, as most irreversible things begin quietly and without announcement. Ashmore Hall was a long gray stone house set back from the road behind a double avenue of elms, in a county of rolling chalk downland and slow rivers, and the particular damp that seeps into stone walls and stays there regardless of the fires lit against it. The house had stood for 140 years, and in all that time it had passed from father to eldest son without interruption, which was a fact. The Deverell family treated not as good fortune, but as the natural order of things. The current Earl Edward Deverell had inherited it, at 27 too, on the death of his father after a chest illness that moved fast. He had not been prepared for the title, and he had not been prepared for the woman his mother had already decided would carry it forward. He had met Cecily Holt at a dinner in London, in the autumn before his father died. He had not been looking for a wife. He had been looking across a room in which he knew no one, in the way of a man who would rather be in a library than a drawing room, and he had seen her at the edge of a small group near the fireplace, listening with her head tilted and her brown eyes steady on the person speaking, and he had thought, almost against his will, that she was paying attention in a way the room did not deserve. He had spoken to her twice that evening and found her more intelligent than he had been given to expect, and quieter in her intelligence than he found comfortable. because quiet intelligence in another person has a way of making one aware of one's own noise. He had thought about her afterward. He had not expected to think about her afterward. They were married in the spring of that year. Quietly, at the church in Mayfair, in a ceremony that his mother had organized with the efficiency of a woman conducting a military exercise. Cecily had worn white muslin and a small bonnet with a cream ribbon, and had looked, to the assembled guests, like a young woman who understood exactly what she had entered into and had made her peace with it. She had not looked uncertain. She had not looked radiant in the way of brides who have been anticipating this moment since childhood. She had looked like herself, which was what Edward had noticed, and what had made him, standing beside her at the altar, feel the particular relief of a man who has found something he did not know he had been searching for. His mother had not been pleased. Dorothea Deverall, the Dowager Countess of Ashmore, was a woman who organized her displeasure with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She did not express it at once. She let it accumulate. She watched Cecily settle into the house with the careful attention of a person inspecting a structure for the flaw that will eventually cause the whole to fail. She noted the things Cecily did well, and she noted the things she did not do in the manner Dorothea would have wished, and she kept her own counsel. And she waited. The thing she was waiting for was an heir. 6 months passed, and there was no child. 9 months, and the household had begun to be aware of the silence around the subject. Cecily was aware of it too. She felt it in the way one feels a change in weather before it arrives, a pressure at the edges of things, a quality of attention in the rooms she entered. She had not spoken of it to Edward. She would not have known how to begin. It was in the 10th month that the Dowager summoned her own physician from London, a man named Hartwell, who had attended the family for 30 years, and had him speak to Cecily on the grounds that it was a matter of the family's health and concern. Hartwell examined her and wrote a letter, which Cecily never read. And the letter was given to the Dowager, and the Dowager read it. And then she held it. The letter said that Cecily had presented with some months of disrupted monthly complaints, which the physician attributed to the adjustment of a young woman newly settled in an unfamiliar household. He noted she was 23 years old and in good health, and saw no cause for particular concern. The Dowager read this letter, and she chose what to do with it, and what she chose was not honesty. On a Thursday evening in late March, she called Edward into the withdrawing room at Ashmore and closed the door, and she set the letter on the table, and she said, "She is Barren, Edward." The physician confirmed it. There is nothing more to be said. He was 32 years old, and he had been Earl of Ashmore for 5 years, and he had not yet learned that his mother could lie to him. He had known her to exaggerate, and to manage, and to arrange things to her own preference. But he had not known her to look him in the eye and state a falsehood as a fact. He did not know it then either, because he believed her. He asked to see the letter. She gave it to him. He held it without reading it carefully, the way a man holds a document he has already accepted as true, and he said nothing for a long time, and his mother watched his face. And she said, "It is a hard thing. The line must be protected. You know this." He knew it. He had always known it. The weight of the line was something he had been handed at birth and had never set down. He had not expected to find that it was heavier than a marriage. The papers were drawn up in the 2nd week of April. They called it a separation on grounds of incompatibility, which was the language that caused the least damage to all parties, which meant the language that caused the most damage to Cecily, and distributed it as evenly as the law permitted. She was given what her marriage settlement required, which was enough to live on without comfort, and she was given 3 days to collect her things, and she was given no reason beyond the one Edward came to her room to deliver, in a voice that did not waver, and a face that did not change. But because he had spent 2 days deciding that if he was going to do this thing, he would do it without flinching, which was its own kind of cowardice. He said it was for the good of the family. He said he was sorry. He did not say the word his mother had used, and she did not know until much later that it had been used at all. Cecily did not weep. She pressed her mouth to a line and she nodded and she said, "I understand," which was true, in its way, though what she understood and what he meant were not the same thing. She understood that she had been weighed and found insufficient, and that the sentence was final, and that arguing was not a thing available to her. She asked for one small thing, which was that the carriage take her not to London but to Wiltshire, to the village where her father had been a country solicitor, and where one person she trusted still lived. Edward said yes to that at least. It was a small thing. It cost him nothing to say yes to a carriage. He told himself that afterward for a long time. On the morning she left, she went to the room where she had kept her sewing things, and she took from the basket a length of blue ribbon she had meant to trim a cuff with, and she cut 6 inches of it with the small scissors and tied it around her left wrist. She was not certain why she did this. It was not a keepsake of the house. It was not a keepsake of him. It was something she was choosing to take because it was hers. Because on that morning the list of things she could name as hers was very short, and the ribbon was on it. She got into the carriage, and Ashmore Hall disappeared behind the elms, and she did not look back. The road to Larkfield took the better part of a day, with a change of horses at the Midway Inn, and Cecily spent most of it looking out the window at the chalk country, going soft and gray under the April rain, and not thinking about anything in particular, which was a discipline she had been practicing for 2 weeks and had not yet mastered. Agnes Pole's cottage stood at the near edge of the village, with a garden that ran to the wall, and a front room that smelled of dried herbs and old wood, and the particular warmth of a house that has been kept by the same careful hands for 40 years. Agnes had known Cecily's mother. They had been girls together in this county, and when Cecily's father died 2 years past, Agnes had written a letter of condolence that was so specific and so warm that Cecily had kept it in the drawer with her other documents of value. Agnes had not heard from Cecily in 18 months. She opened the door on the second knock, looked at Cecily's face, looked at the single trunk on the step, and said nothing except, "Come in then," and stood aside, which was the right response, and the only one Cecily could have received that evening without falling to pieces. She did not fall to pieces. She went inside, and she sat at Agnes's kitchen table, and she accepted the cup of tea that was set in front of her, and she explained what had happened in the particular flat voice that comes from having arranged a story into the most bearable version of itself. Agnes listened with her hands around her own cup, and when Cecily finished, Agnes said, "And have you told him?" Cecily did not understand at first. Agnes looked at her with steady gray eyes and waited. It was the first time Cecily admitted aloud, or to herself, that she was not certain. She had been uncertain for 3 weeks, and she had not permitted herself to count the uncertainty, because the uncertainty would have changed everything, and she had needed to get through those 3 weeks without changing everything. Now she was in Agnes's kitchen, and it was too late for it to change anything that had already happened, and so she said quietly that she did not know, and Agnes said equally quietly that they would find out. By the end of April they knew. Cecily sat with this knowledge for a full day before she spoke of it again. She sat with it in Agnes's front room, and she looked at the ribbon on her wrist, and she thought about writing to Edward, and she thought about what the letter would say and what he would do with it and what his mother would do with it after that. And she decided, with the clear calm of a woman who has been reduced to the things she actually values, that she would not write yet. She would wait. She would let the truth be born on its own terms. She would not send a letter that could be dismissed or disbelieved or managed, because she knew now in a way she had not known before that she was capable of being dismissed and disbelieved and managed. She would wait until the truth could speak for itself in a form that could not be held by anyone, in a season that was not yet here. It was a form of courage that required her to be very quiet for a very long time. Summer came to Larkfield, warm and slow. Cecily took on 2 pupils from the village, children of a local farmer who wanted his daughters to learn to read well and to manage figures, and she taught them in Agnes's front room 3 mornings a week for a small fee that helped with the household accounts and kept her mind occupied and gave her a reason to be careful and precise about language. numbers in a way she had always found comforting. The girls were 6 and 8 years old, and they were loud and not always attentive, but they were kind to each other and curious about everything. And on the days when the weight of her situation pressed most heavily, they reliably said something that made her forget to feel it for an hour. She was in the village on a Thursday morning in late July, in Mabley's dry goods shop, when she heard her name used in the manner of someone who does not know the person they are speaking about is present. She had come for thread. She was at the far end of the counter, half hidden by a display of folded cloth, and the 2 women at the near end did not see her. One of them she knew by sight as a Mrs. Carver from the estate at Bramley, 3 miles east of Larkfield, the sort of woman who knew a great deal about the affairs of neighboring houses and organized this knowledge as a form of civic duty. Mrs. Carver was saying in a tone of practiced sympathy, "They say the new countess was Barren. Poor creature. The earl had no choice, I suppose. The line must be maintained, and if the woman cannot provide for it, what is one to do?" The other woman made a sound of agreement. Cecily stood very still at the far end of the counter. She had both hands on the surface in front of her, palms flat, and she looked at the fabric of the shelf below the glass, and she breathed, once, slowly, and she said nothing. The women finished their business and left. The shopkeeper, a young man who had gone red with discomfort, said, without quite meeting her eyes, "Can I help you, ma'am?" She bought her thread. She walked home in the August heat with the brown paper parcel under her arm and the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided that the only response available to her is to still be standing when it is over. She was still standing. That would have to be enough. It was not until the following week that Edward came. He had not come to see her. He had come to Larkfield on estate business, because the Ashmore lands extended into this corner of the county, and there was a matter of a disputed field boundary with a neighboring farmer that his steward had been managing without resolution, and Edward had finally come to resolve it himself. He came on a Tuesday, and he was in the village for most of the morning, and it was purely the angle of the sun and the position of the window in Mabley's dry goods shop that meant he happened to look across the lane as he passed. He saw a woman come out of the shop, with a parcel under her arm, and turn toward the far end of the lane. She was wearing a dark blue spencer over a cream gown that was slightly too large for her, and her dark hair was in a simple knot, and she walked with a particular deliberateness, as though she was being careful to take the ground she had. He did not know at first why she stopped him where he stood. Then he knew, and the knowledge was like stepping through ice. He stood on the far side of the lane for a long moment, watching her walk away. He did not cross. He did not call after her. He told himself he had no right to. And he told himself she would not want him to. And he told himself this was not the moment. And all of these things were true, and none of them were the reason. The reason was that he had looked at her from across a lane and understood, in the way one sometimes understands things before the mind has caught up to the body, that he had done something that could not be undone, and the full weight of it had arrived at last. He went back to Ashmore that afternoon without resolving the boundary dispute. His steward was surprised. He said nothing to his steward, and he said nothing to his mother, who was in the drawing room when he arrived, and who asked him about his day, in the bright, deliberate voice of a woman who knows her son is troubled and has decided the trouble is not her concern. He went to the study. He sat at his desk. He did not open any of the letters waiting there. That evening after dinner, when the house was quiet and his mother had retired, he went to the small correspondence room off the library, where she kept her personal papers. He had been in this room perhaps 4 times in his life. He had no particular reason to be in it now, except that the feeling that had arrived on the lane in Larkfield had not left him, and it had taken on a specific shape, and the shape was the shape of a letter he had held once without reading carefully. He found what he was looking for in the 3rd drawer, filed behind the correspondence for the previous year, in a thin paper cover with Hartwell's name on the outside. He took it to the library and read it under the lamp. He read it once. He read it a second time. He set it flat on the desk and looked at it, and the room around him was very quiet. The fire had burned low. He read it a third time slowly, parsing each sentence with the care of a man who is certain he has missed something and is not finding it. There was nothing to find. The letter said what it said. It did not say Barren. It did not use the word at all. It named a disruption of monthly health. It named a young woman adjusting to a new household. It named careful monitoring in the coming months as the physician's recommendation. It was, in its way, a letter of patience. Wait, see. Do not act in haste. His mother had given him this letter and told him it confirmed barrenness. He sat with that for a long time. If you are still here with this story, and I believe you are, the question that is burning in this moment is the same one that burned in that library at Ashmore. How far a person can travel in the wrong direction before the reckoning catches them. Leave a thought in the comments, if you like, on what you would have done in that room. Because what Edward did, he did slowly. And it mattered that he did it slowly. He did not go to his mother. That night, he had learned from watching her that a confrontation conducted in heat produces a managed response. And what he wanted was not her management. He thought about Cecily and the lane. He thought about the blue Spencer and the parcel, and the deliberate way she had walked away from him, not knowing he was watching, not performing anything for his benefit, simply being exactly herself without any audience at all. He thought about the months at Ashmore and the things he had not said when he should have said them, the questions he had not asked, because the asking would have been an admission that he doubted what he had been told, and he had not been ready to doubt it. He had not asked. That was the plain truth of it. He had been given a letter and a conclusion, and he had accepted both, and Cecily had been standing on the other side of a door the entire time, and he had not opened it. He folded Hartwell's letter and put it in the breast pocket of his coat, and he went to bed, and he did not sleep. In Larkfield, autumn arrived early. By the third week of September, the elms along the church lane had gone yellow, and the mornings were cold, and Cecily had stopped walking to the village because it had become too much effort, and her body had made certain demands on her attention that did not allow for long distances. Agnes had engaged a woman from the village to help in the house, and had said nothing about it except that she was getting too old to carry coal. It was in the last days of September that the letter came from Cecily's cousin Margaret, who was the only member of Cecily's own family who had written to her since the separation, and whose letters arrived intermittently and always somewhat delayed, as though they had been composed in a hurry and then held for several days before being sent. Margaret's letter was 2 pages long, and it contained a great deal of news about her own household, and a rather breathless account of a concert she had attended in Bath. And it was not until the second page that the thing arrived that changed the quality of the air in the room. Agnes read the letter aloud because Cecily's eyes had been troubling her in the low light, and she read without knowing what was coming, in her steady voice, until she reached the passage, and then she stopped. She read it again, silently, and then she looked at Cecily. Margaret had written that she had heard from Mrs. Pravey, Tilbury, who had it from a very reliable source connected to the Ashmore household, that the Earl's solicitors had begun proceedings for an annulment of the marriage to be sought on the grounds of barren constitution. I thought you should know, though I do not know what can be done about it, and I pray you are well, wherever you are. There was a silence in the room. Agnes set the letter down. She said carefully, "Cecily." Cecily was looking at the window. The ribbon at her wrist was very still. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said in the measured voice she had been constructing for 7 months, "It does not matter." Agnes did not say that it did matter. She was 60 years old, and she had known Cecily's mother, and she knew what it cost a young woman to say, "It does not matter," in that particular voice. She said, "What do you mean to do?" Cecily put her hand on her own middle, not a dramatic gesture, just a quiet, proprietary touch of a woman who has been doing this without thinking for several months. She said, "I mean to wait 5 more days. That is what Mr. Fenwick says. 5 days, perhaps 7, and then the truth will exist in a form that cannot be managed or held or sent back to London in a letter. And then I will decide." Agnes looked at her steadily. She said, "And if it comes to it before then?" Cecily turned from the window and met her eyes, and there was something in her face that was not bitterness, and was not triumph, and was not quite either of the things one might have expected. It was the look of a woman who has been very quiet for a long time, and has decided that the quiet was not weakness, and was not surrender, but was rather the only form of strategy available to her, and who is prepared to be patient for 5 more days. She said, "Then it comes." It came on the 5th of October, early in the morning, before the sun had cleared the stone wall. The day after, Edward arrived. He had not known. He could not have known. He came to Larkfield because he had been coming to Larkfield in pieces since July, when he had stood in a lane and watched a woman walk away from him with a parcel under her arm, and each time he had not done what he had come to do, and the cost of not doing it had risen incrementally in the way of debts one does not pay. He had sent his steward ahead the previous afternoon on the matter of the field boundary, which was finally being resolved. And he had followed the next morning, telling himself that this time he would find a way to ask her to receive him. He had been telling himself this for 3 weeks. He had written 2 letters and sent neither. He arrived in Larkfield on the morning of the 6th in his carriage, and he saw from the lane that Mrs. Cullerpreet Pole's door was standing open, and that there was a curious stillness about the cottage. There was somehow also a kind of aliveness, the way a room is alive in a specific way when something has very recently happened in it. He knocked. Agnes opened the door, and for a moment she looked at him with the particular expression of a woman deciding whether to let a man inside who has forfeited his welcome, and then she stood aside and said quietly, "She is awake." The room was warm with firelight. Cecily was sitting up in the bed, not lying down because she had never been a woman who could lie down for long without becoming restless, and she was holding one of the children, the girl, and she looked at Edward when he came through the door with the direct brown eyes he had first seen across a room in London, and she did not say anything at all. He looked at her. He looked at the child in her arms, and then at the cradle where the boy was asleep. He stood in the doorway of the small bedroom in Larkfield, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, his voice very low, "I read the letter." She knew which letter. She pressed her mouth to a line, not in displeasure, but in the way of a woman who is deciding how much she needs to say. He said, "I did not ask to read it at the time. I should have asked. That is, on me, and I know it." There was a long silence. The fire shifted. The girl in Cecily's arms made a small sound and then subsided. Cecily said, "What will you do now?" He said, "Whatever you will permit me to do." She looked at him for a moment longer. She said, "There is a dinner tonight, at the Assembly Rooms. The Waverley family, and your mother, and half of this county. Mr. Burrows tells me the documents are already prepared. He has been waiting for a direction." He understood what she was saying. She was not asking him to do anything. She was telling him the situation and leaving the rest to him. And there was something in this that was both harder and more dignified than a direct request would have been. She was not going to ask him to save her. She was going to tell him what existed and what was possible and let him decide for himself, because she had decided that his choice needed to be his own, or it was worth nothing at all. He said, "Then I will go to the dinner." He left the cottage, and he went to find Thomas Burrows. The Assembly Rooms in Larkfield were the largest interior space the village possessed, a long room above the inn, with tall windows that looked onto the churchyard and a floor that had been danced on for 50 years and showed it. The Waverley family occupied the far end of the table, with Miss Judith Waverley in a pale yellow gown at her mother's right hand, looking, as she always did, like someone who has arrived correctly and is waiting for the event to acknowledge it. The Dowager Countess of Ashmore sat at the head of the left side, in black silk and pearls, with the particular composure of a woman who is the most important person in the room and knows it. The room was full. It was the kind of dinner that local society attends when it wishes to see and be seen, and to have confirmed that the important things are still where they belong. Edward arrived after the first course had been served. He came through the door at the far end of the room, and he walked the length of it, in his navy tailcoat and white cravat, with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided on a direction and has stopped calculating the cost. The room watched him, as rooms watch people who move with that specific quality of intention, the way one watches a figure cross a stage when the footlights have shifted. He stopped at the head of the table. He stood for a moment looking at his mother, who looked back at him, with the composed face of a woman who is not yet alarmed, but is beginning to take the measure of the situation. He said, in a voice that carried without being raised to the room and to her equally, "Cecily Deverall is the mother of my heirs, and my wife." 11 words. He said them level, without heat, without theatricality, without the slight emphasis of a man proving a point. He said them the way one states a fact that has always been true, and is now simply being acknowledged. Dorothea Deverell sat with her hands still on the table. She did not speak immediately. She had the self-possession of a woman who has survived many social reversals, and she was applying it now, but it was not quite equal to this moment, and the slight movement at her jaw betrayed it. She said after a moment in a measured voice, "Edward, this is not the place." He said, "I know, Mother." He said nothing else to her. He looked at Miss Waverley, who was watching him with dark eyes and the particular stillness of a young woman taking a situation's measure. And he said, "I am sorry to have placed you in this position. It was not fairly done to you." Judith Waverley looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at her mother and she said with a quietness that the room could barely hear, "No, it was not." And then she looked at her plate. Her mother said nothing. The room said nothing. The firelight moved on the walls of the assembly rooms, and outside, through the tall windows, the churchyard elms were dark against the evening sky. Thomas Burrows was already at the door. The legal confirmation was completed the following morning, in the parlor of Mr. Burrows's office on the Market Square, with Mr. Comperson. Fenwick's documentation of the birth laid on the desk and Burrows's own witnessed account of Cecily's residence in Larkfield alongside it. Edward signed where he was directed to sign. He read each document before he signed it, which he had not done 6 months ago, and which he noticed, and which cost him something he received without complaint. The annulment proceedings were formally withdrawn by the Ashmore solicitors that afternoon. The Dowager did not attend any of this. She returned to Ashmore Hall on the morning after the dinner in the family carriage, with her maid and her traveling case, and she sat in the carriage without looking out the window, which was unlike her. She had spent 58 years in a world that rewarded certainty, and she had been certain, and the certainty had produced this, and she was not yet at the place where she could name what the certainty had actually been. That naming would come later. On a winter morning, when she held her granddaughter for the first time and understood, looking at the child's face, that she had very nearly ensured this person did not exist. She would not recover from that understanding quickly. She would recover. Miss Waverley returned to her family's estate in Hertfordshire on the following Monday. She wrote no letter and received none, and the season would go on, and she was 22 years old, and her life was not finished. What had been set in motion had worked itself out, not cleanly, not without cost, but completely. The machinery that had been turned against Cecily had been run to its end, and at the end it had found the truth already there, patient and undeniable, in the form of 2 children asleep in a borrowed cradle. The evening of the 6th of October was cold and clear, with the new moon barely visible above the churchyard wall and a fire burning in Mrs. Pole's front room that made the whole small cottage smell of wood smoke and warmth. Agnes had gone to her sister's house for the night on the understanding that she was not needed, which was her way of making herself available in the morning. Cecily sat in the chair by the cradle, with the girl asleep in her arms and the boy asleep beside her, and she was more tired than she had words for. But the tiredness was not the same as the tiredness of the 7 months before it. That tiredness had been the tiredness of a person spending effort on remaining intact. This was the honest tiredness of a person who has come through something. Edward came in from the cold at 7:30, with the particular awkwardness of a man who is not certain where to stand in a room he has no prior right to, and he stood in the doorway of the front room for a moment. He had been with Burroughs most of the afternoon. He had not eaten since morning. Cecily said, without looking up from the child in her arms, "There is bread on the table." He went to the table and stood there for a moment, and then he sat. He ate a piece of bread. He did not try to fill the room with speech. After a while she said, "I knew in April." He said, "I know." She said, "I thought about writing to you." He said, "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I needed you to come of your own reason, not because you had been handed an obligation." He looked at her. She was still looking at the child, her dark eyes steady, and her expression the same expression she had worn across a drawing room in London, and across an altar, and across a lane in July, always paying attention to the thing in front of her with the whole of herself, never performing it. He said, "I am here of my own reason." She looked at him then. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she reached across the small table between them, and she extended her left hand, the one with the ribbon. He looked at the ribbon. He knew from Agnes, who had told him that morning when he arrived at the cottage, and she had looked at his face and decided he needed to know, that Cecily had knotted it at her wrist on the morning she left Ashmore, and had not removed it in 7 months. He did not ask why. He understood why, or he understood enough of why, that the rest could wait. He took her hand carefully in both of his. He turned her wrist. He untied the ribbon slowly, and he held it for a moment, and then he looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. He tied the ribbon back around her wrist, in a proper bow this time, with more patience than he had thought himself capable of at that moment. When he was done, she did not pull her hand back. He did not release it. Outside the cottage window, the first leaves of autumn were moving in the cold air, gone red and gold along the churchyard wall, and the moon had risen clear above the elms. The fire burned in the grate. The 2 children slept in their cradle, one turned toward the other, their breathing small and even and absolutely steady. The blue ribbon was at her wrist. He held her hand. The room was warm. If this story has stayed with you, if Cecily's 7 months of quiet, and the way she waited for the truth to arrive on its own terms, has moved you at all, leave a word in the comments. Stories like this one live longest in the places where people say, simply, "I felt that. Thank you for being here." Until the end.